please remember to leave a like, a comment, share the video about, and if you haven't already, subscribe. Thank you. Well, isn't this just fantastic? Captain's Log, Supplemental. We here at the Halls of Injustice just love to find ways to ensure that those incarcerated suffer for the longest period of time possible. This includes charging rent for the ISO cube, and while taxation may be theft to many, we literally tax anything we can tax on them while they're in prison with us. So when they do leave, they owe us money and end up coming back. Welcome everyone to the Halls of Injustice. Today we welcome inmates? Number 175 to the ISO cubes, but not to the ISO cubes at the same time. You see, they've already served their time, but much like another one we've covered in the past, and quite recently I might add, the person we're going to be discussing today should never have gone to prison in the first place, which raises a number of questions. Quite a few. On a semi-regular basis, I like to criticise the UK police for being an absolute meme, a joke, a contradiction, and corrupt. Shocking, I know. The police are supposed to protect and serve, not protect and self-serve. So with who we are going to speak of today, Andrew Malkinson, we're going to be talking about another case of a genuine injustice that has been kept that way for so long because of the UK police failing to perform their duty, so desperate to hit a target for convictions that they would willingly ignore all evidence that would indicate Andrew Malkinson's innocence, which has cost Andrew Malkinson 17 years of his life. 17 years. I could rant and rave about the inadequacies, the failing, and the corruption involved, the toxic environment of desperation to hit KPIs, so desperate just to label somebody rather than seek out the truth. This video could well have become a 45-minute TED Talk. So before we get into the crime that Andrew Malkinson was accused of, sentenced for in fact, we need to tell you a little bit about who he is, beyond an innocent man. According to Wikipedia, Andrew Malkinson was born either in 1965 or 1966. In Grimsby. He grew up in Grimsby. Grimsby, much like every other place in the United Kingdom, lives up to a name, Grim. In his 20s and 30s, he travelled and worked overseas. In 1993, he started working in the Netherlands and actually became a permanent resident, where he lived there for 10 years. In the summer of 2003, he was on a visit to Manchester, where he got a temporary job as a security guard at a shopping centre. That is all the information we have about who he is. But I will add something of interest now. Him being a travelling and working overseas type was used and framed a rather different way when this all went to court. The crime he is accused of is incredibly heinous, and to receive a life sentence, or to serve 17 years of one, would indicate something quite horrible, horrifying. Yes, okay. Consider that a trigger warning. No, it is not unalive, it is the one of RAPE. Now we need to talk about the conviction of Andrew Malkinson, and then the fallout, the appeals, the fallout, his release, and the final fallout. Because this only really came to light, newsworthy, because of something really stupid the prisons did right at the end after he was finally released. On the 19th of July 2003 in the early hours, a female victim by the name of Jane Doe, 33 years old, was walking home in Little Hulton. She was dragged down a motorway embankment, strangled, still unconscious, and sustained the following injuries: swollen left eye, which she could barely open, a fractured cheekbone, bruising to her neck, scratches and scrapes to her back, legs and arms, and severe injury to her left nipple. After she lost consciousness, she was RAPED. How Malkinson ties into this was, he was identified by the victim in an identity parade lineup. However, she gave a number of descriptions of the perpetrator. For example, she described the attacker as being 3 inches shorter than Malkinson, with a hairless chest and no tattoos. Andrew Malkinson had chest hair and prominent tattoos on both his forearms. She said the attacker would have a deep scratch to his face because she scratched him so hard she had broken one of her fingernails. Andrew Malkinson was at work the next day with no scratches on his face. He also did not have a Bolton accent, which Jane Doe had identified the attacker as having. Additionally, there was not one shred, not one cell, not one molecule, not one atom of DNA evidence linking him to the crime at the time. So you have an identity parade where he is chosen even though he does not match a single shred of anything Jane Doe had identified as the attacker. Now I really do understand that in heat of certain moments, and certainly after going through a certain type of trauma, things are all over the place. But this would indicate, it would lead me to believe certainly that someone had led her to choose Andrew Malkinson. And based on some of the fallout we'll get to soon, there is a level of credence lent to it. Andrew Malkinson was charged with 2 counts of RAPE and attempting to choke, suffocate or strangle with intent to commit RAPE, and attempted murder. I don't understand how I can get away with saying one of those words but not the other, but YouTube is YouTube, am I right? This went to trial at Manchester Crown Court, and he was, Andrew Malkinson, presented as a drifter, which made very little sense, considering he had spent 10 years working in the Netherlands. They portrayed him as somebody that likes to jump in the back of a train and sleep there with his hobo pie. After less than 10 hours of deliberation, a jury returned with a verdict of guilty on 2 counts of RAPE and attempting to choke, suffocate or strangle with intent to commit RAPE. He was found not guilty though of attempted murder. The jury voted 10-2 majority. Whoever the 2 were that voted innocent, well done for actually having 2 functioning brain cells. Now he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 7 years. He maintained his innocence throughout the entire trial. He maintained his innocence after the trial. But this is the part where we get to talk about some of the fallout, because he appealed, rightly so. Every person, regardless of innocence or guilt, has the right to appeal. This man is innocent though, but he suffers from a condition called innocent prisoner's dilemma, and we need to talk about that as part of the fallout. The level of corruption involved stretches back to the Greater Manchester Police, who took every step they could to dismiss every single appeal. This would include the then police chief. After 6.5 years, he was actually eligible for parole, but the police decided not to, outright refusing to on multiple occasions, due to a condition known as innocent prisoner's dilemma. This is a detrimental effect of a legal system in which admission of guilt can result in reduced sentences or early parole. When an innocent person is wrongly convicted of a crime, legal systems which need the individual to admit guilt, as for example a prerequisite step leading to parole, punish an innocent person for their integrity and reward a person lacking in integrity. Something which is very important to acknowledge now is he maintained his innocence for 17 years. His integrity is the highest it could ever be. There have been cases where innocent prisoners were given the choice between freedom in exchange for claiming guilt and remaining imprisoned and telling the truth. United States law professor Daniel Medwed say convicts who go before a parole board maintaining their innocence are caught in a catch-22 that he calls the innocent prisoner's dilemma, because a false admission of guilt and remorse by an innocent person at a parole hearing may prevent a later investigation proving their innocence. It also prevents the legal system from being able to convict the correct person. The point of the criminal justice system is to prove beyond reasonable doubt guilt. In the trial of Andrew Malkinson, they proved nothing, yet he was convicted anyway and sentenced to life. The Greater Manchester Police, for years, dismissed every single appeal, even the ones that said, by the way, no evidence here proves anything. In fact, you've not proven anything at all. When you have an e-fit released by the police of the attacker and they look like this, for the then accused to be the one identified as looking like this, something is sus. How Andrew Malkinson was able to secure his freedom was because of Trish. Trish is his mother, and that's where I'd like to take you next, because for 2 decades she was considered a crazy old lady who refused to believe the truth. 2 years after his initial incarceration, his mother finally got to see him at Durham prison. She felt like a prisoner at the time because of how you have to surrender all your stuff to be searched, yeah? Malkinson built his case for innocence as best he could while he was still behind bars and relied on his mother heavily for information about the appeals he had lodged and whether there had been any advances in DNA testing. In the early 2000s, she did not have access to a laptop, so she spent a lot of time in the local library, aided by a young librarian who would help her to use the computer. To give Andrew the updates though, because of how corrupt the system was, she had to use coded language so that the prison could not use his continued quest for innocence against him. The only things that kept him going were the visits from his mother and letters who he had been with prior to his incarceration. She was meant to be a character witness, in fact, but at that time they were unwilling to fly her out, or unable to fly her out. From a lady he was friends with in the Netherlands, who would over the years continue to send him letters. In December 2020, after a newspaper wrote to Andrew Malkinson while he was still in prison, he admitted most of the time his life was utterly unbearable and like a never-ending psychological torture. He was released on parole the same month on the grounds of good behaviour, but it was then that the Sunday Times published full details of new evidence which had come to light courtesy of Appeal, a charity that investigates miscarriages of justice. Appeal had found that the police breached identity parade guidelines when they drove the victim and a witness together to identify Malkinson. The witness initially chose another man, then left the room with a police officer. On her return though, she identified Malkinson as the rapist instead. Names of other suspects put forward to the police were never traced, including more than one who had previous convictions for RAPE. The victim described scratching her attacker in the face, and Malkinson appeared at work the following day with no scratches. Two key witnesses had 16 convictions for 38 offences between them, including for dishonesty. It emerged that key evidence, including the victim's clothes, had been destroyed by Greater Manchester Police. They wanted to put him behind bars. The case had been rejected twice by the Criminal Cases Review Commission. He only got out because of parole. Parole, not because of his innocence. So where is it that he's innocent? For that, we actually skip to July 2023. I guess we now need to talk about the price of freedom as well. Owing to the situation he was granted, i.e. parole, he couldn't get a job. So naturally he invested his time into proving his innocence to clear his name. In July 2023, the Court of Appeals quashed the conviction. They quashed it because of the breach of the rules by the police. They quashed it because of the lack of evidence. They quashed it because witnesses changed their stories. The conviction was quashed because the wrong man served 17 years in prison. Greater Manchester Police had issued an apology. Malkinson correctly identified it as meaningless, and that he felt forcibly kidnapped by the state. He no longer feels like he belongs in this country. But what really overturned it was that there was in fact DNA evidence linking another man to the crime. Funny that. Almost like it was suppressed for 17 years for no reason whatsoever. Owing to this result, Andrew Malkinson would very much like to get a Dutch passport, perhaps as a gift from the Foreign Office, so he can go live there instead, on humanitarian grounds of course. He had missed out on seeing his son grow up. He had not been able to visit his sisters in Australia. But it's okay everyone, he got an apology from Greater Manchester Police. He is going to be suing, and hopefully he will receive a sizable portion of, let's call it compensation, reparations. But this is why he's featured in the news. You see, he may have to instead pay prison accommodation and food costs that will be deducted from any compensation he wins for his ordeal. I'm sorry, what? You're charging him rent and board? You took away the man's freedom. You took away his privacy, his dignity, his integrity. You tried to erode at the very fabric of this man. You took it all away and shoved him in a cell for 17 years, labelled a RAPIST, for no reason whatsoever, I might add. There is no validation you could ever provide that would justify doing what you, Greater Manchester Police, did to this man. But that's what you did. And then, upon being given parole, he correctly manages to appeal and have his conviction overturned. Greater Manchester Police issue a apology, and then at some point someone gives him an invoice for the food and for the room. Bitch, you should be lucky he's not being given the prison to sell as an asset, and I hope he's given 7 figures. I really am, because I can't think of anyone more deserving than someone wrongly convicted for something like this. And of course I feel bad for Jane Doe, who for 17 years believed the correct man had been sent to prison. But then in reality, the witness there, along with being led by the police, did they really know that the right person had been sentenced in the first place? The UK police are a joke. They need judges.